At 7:23 a.m., the forest spoke first, not with words, but with the ripping saw scream of a German MG-42 cutting through the trees. Somewhere off to the east, the gun hammered in long bursts, and the sound bounced between trunks until you couldn't tell if it was 50 yards away or 500. Snow shook loose from branches. Splinters snapped. Men yelled for cover that didn't exist. Under a fallen oak pressed into frozen mud, a single American rifleman lay so low the world above him might as well have been another planet. 6 feet overhead, bullets shredded bark and twigs. At ground level, there was only damp cold, the taste of metal, and the slow, controlled breath of someone trying not to become a silhouette. He wasn't a legendary sniper with a nickname and a tally carved into a rifle stock. In the Hürtgen, legends didn't last long. He was the kind of soldier armies are built from, an expert shot on a qualification range, a hunter back home, a quiet man who watched patterns and learned fast. Later, stories would attach a name to him, maybe more than one. But on that morning, he was simply a rifleman who decided the rules were killing his friends. The platoon was pinned. You could hear it in the scattered return fire. Single shots, panicked bursts, then silence as heads went down again. Somewhere in the snow ahead, a medic crawled, dragging a man by his web gear, the wounded soldier's boots carving 2 dark lines behind him. The machine gun kept chewing at the branches, walking its fire higher, searching for movement at eye level and above. That's what everyone looked for in a forest fight. The obvious threat, the ridge, the tree line, the trunk where a barrel might poke out. Nobody expected death to come from a slit of darkness beneath a log. The rifleman's cheek was welded to cold wood and steel. He had a narrow horizontal view, tree bases, low brush, the small rises and depressions where men disappeared. He couldn't see the sky. He couldn't see the crowns where artillery burst and turned pine into shrapnel. He didn't want to. Up there was where people died. If you've never heard of the Hürtgen forest, that's part of the story. From September into mid-December 1944, American units fought a grinding battle in a dense, wet, mined woodland along the German border. An 80-plus day slugging match that bled divisions white. Visibility in many places collapsed to a few dozen yards. Trails funneled whole companies into pre-sighted kill zones. Mines and booby traps waited under leaves and snow. Tanks bogged in mud. Radios failed under the canopy. Artillery burst in the treetops, and splinters rained down like knives. Men called it a meat grinder of timber. The mission wasn't glamorous. It was practical and brutal. Push through the woods, break the defenses tied to the Siegfried Line, and fight for ground that controlled approaches and dams that could flood valleys. The Germans had bunkers, wire, mortars, and positions registered to every likely path. The Americans had courage, numbers, and a doctrine built for places you could actually see. That mismatch is where this story lives. In more open terrain, you wanted height. You wanted long sight lines and dominant angles, what instructors preached on ranges and in training pamphlets. But the Hürtgen punished anything that looked textbook. A man up a tree was a dark shape against a paler background. A man on a ridge was a landmark. A muzzle flash above the brush was an invitation for a counter-sniper, or worse, a mortar section that could drop around on the exact patch of earth you thought was safe. The Germans had been fighting in forests since the early years of the war. They understood what the Americans were learning the hard way. In thick timber, elevation doesn't always give you control. Sometimes it gives the enemy a target. So soldiers adapted, not through official memos or neat diagrams, but through whispered advice in frozen foxholes. Don't skyline yourself. Don't climb. Don't trust the manuals when the manuals don't mention tree bursts. Sink into the ground. Become part of the forest. Back under the oak, the rifleman waited while the machine gun worked. He let the noise cover him. He watched for boots and knees, for movement at the level predators expect. He wasn't thinking about medals. He wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about the simplest problem in war: how to keep the next man from bleeding out in the snow. And in the next few hours, from a place most soldiers never even considered a firing position, he would prove something the forest had been teaching all along. Sometimes the safest high ground is no high ground at all. What killed men in the Hürtgen wasn't a lack of bravery. It wasn't even a lack of skill. It was the quiet collision between doctrine and terrain, between what soldiers were taught to do and what the forest punished without mercy. By late 1944, the U.S. Army did not have a single, unified sniper doctrine the way people imagine today. There was no dedicated sniper school pumping out specialists with standardized techniques. Most snipers were simply expert riflemen pulled from line units, handed a scoped rifle if one was available, and told to apply marksmanship principles learned in places nothing like the Hürtgen. Training emphasized fundamentals that worked on open ground: find elevation, gain visibility, dominate space with range. On a rifle range, it made perfect sense. In dense forest, it became a death sentence. Elevation promised sight, but it also promised exposure. A man climbing a tree didn't just gain a view. He separated himself from the visual noise of the forest floor. Even through branches, the human shape broke patterns. German snipers, already seasoned by years of woodland fighting in Eastern Europe, knew exactly what to look for. They didn't scan randomly. They searched where doctrine told Americans to be. Men learned this lesson the hard way. Soldiers climbed for observation and never came down. Others took textbook positions in farmhouses or on slight rises and were erased by mortars minutes later. In the Hürtgen, the enemy didn't need to see you clearly. They only needed to suspect where doctrine would place you. The forest did the rest. The rifleman under the oak had watched this pattern repeat. He didn't need a manual to explain it. He had eyes, he had memory. He had names he didn't say out loud anymore. Friends who had followed the rules and died because the rules assumed a battlefield that didn't exist. What made the situation worse was how slowly official thinking could change under fire. Large organizations depend on consistency. Doctrine exists to prevent chaos, to keep thousands of people acting in some kind of order. But doctrine also lags reality. It is written after lessons are learned, not while men are bleeding in the snow, trying to survive long enough to teach them. In the Hürtgen, adaptation happened quietly. Nobody issued orders that said, "Stop climbing trees." No memo banned elevated positions. Instead, soldiers paid attention to who came back alive. They noticed which foxholes stayed intact after tree bursts and which ones filled with splinters. They noticed that German fire often passed overhead, raking branches and trunks at chest height, while the ground beneath remained strangely untouched. German infantry doctrine didn't romanticize elevation in forests. Their snipers and observers worked from depressions, from brush piles, from the shadows between roots. They blended into the ground so completely that American patrols sometimes walked past them at arm's length. They weren't hiding above the forest. They were part of it. The Americans, by contrast, were still thinking vertically. Threats were expected at eye level and higher. Danger came from ridges, tree lines, windows. This shaped how soldiers looked, how they fired, how they reacted under stress, and it shaped how the enemy killed them. The rifleman under the oak understood this instinctively, not because of formal training, but because of experience far from any battlefield. Hunting had taught him something manuals never mentioned. Prey does not scan the sky. It scans the horizon. Predators that attack from above announce themselves. Predators that stay low survive longer. In the forest, humans behave the same way. When shots cracked, heads snapped up. Eyes searched trunks and branches. Weapons rose toward imagined height. Almost no one thought to look down, to question whether the forest floor itself might be watching. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't arrogance. It was pattern recognition under pressure. The difference mattered. Soldiers who broke rules for ego died fast. Soldiers who broke rules because the rules didn't fit reality sometimes lived long enough to change how others fought. The tragedy was that these adaptations rarely carried names. No officer stood up to announce a new method. No report captured the moment a rifleman decided to ignore elevation and disappear instead. It spread the only way practical knowledge spreads in war, through observation, imitation, and survival. By December, the Hürtgen had already chewed through divisions. Casualty numbers climbed not just from bullets and shells, but from cold, trench foot, pneumonia, and exhaustion. Men went down without ever seeing the enemy who killed them. The forest didn't reward courage alone. It rewarded those who learned its rules faster than the enemy could exploit them. Under the fallen oak, the rifleman waited while doctrine failed above him. The machine gun still raged. The platoon was still trapped. But down where the forest floor absorbed sound and shadow, a different logic applied. One not written in manuals. One learned through loss. And in the hours that followed, that logic would reshape how the fight unfolded. Quietly, unofficially, and without permission. Before the forest, there had been streets, tight rows of brick houses, cracked sidewalks, and alleys where backing down meant you learned quickly how pain felt. The rifleman grew up in South Philadelphia, close enough to the docks that the air carried oil and salt. His father loaded ships bound for places the boy would later see in ruins. Money was thin. School came second to work. By 16, he was spending long days riveting steel, learning what fatigue really meant, learning that rushing only made things worse. You waited for the metal to heat. You waited for the foreman to turn away. You waited for the right moment. Then you acted once, cleanly. Outside the city in November woods far from the noise, he hunted not for sport but because meat mattered. Deer taught him patience better than any drill instructor. You learned to move without sound, to read ground the way others read maps, to understand that animals feared not the hunter, but the signals that betrayed him. Movement, scent, careless noise. Cigarette smoke drifted in spooked game long before a body did. The lesson stayed with him when he was drafted and sent south for training, where rifles barked on clean ranges and targets waited politely in the open. Army training turned civilians into riflemen fast and imperfectly. You qualified, you moved on. If you shot well, you were noticed. If you shot well and kept your head down, you were assigned where bodies were needed most. In Europe, replacements arrived already tired, already behind. The forest did not care where you came from or how high you scored. It erased men equally. By the time this rifleman reached the Hürtgen, he had learned the most important rule of combat: pay attention to what actually works, not what is supposed to. He watched friends die following good advice in the wrong place. Men climb because they were told to. Men exposed themselves because visibility was valued. Each loss sharpened something inside him, not anger, not fear, but calculation. The forest punished habits. It rewarded stillness. He began to imagine positions no instructor had ever drawn on a chalkboard, places so low they felt wrong, places where the earth itself provided cover. The idea wasn't revolutionary. It was obvious once you stopped looking up. When he finally spoke to an officer, it wasn't with speeches or theory. It was with simple observation. Men up high were dying. Men low sometimes weren't. The response was predictable. Doctrine existed for a reason. Rules kept order. No one officially approved what followed. No one needed to. In wars like this, permission often arrived in the form of silence, of a turn back, of a quiet understanding that survival mattered more than neat paperwork. By the time the rifleman slid under the fallen oak, he was carrying more than ammunition and cold weather gear. He carried every lesson the forest had taught him through other men's deaths. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was adaptation stripped of ego, a decision made close to the ground, where the forest hid its truths. In the Hürtgen, innovation did not announce itself. It whispered, and only those who listened long enough lived to pass it on. War compresses lives. Weeks replace years. Decisions that once took thought become instinct. The rifleman did not see himself as clever or special. He saw patterns others ignored because they were too busy surviving minute to minute. He noticed how German fire searched high, how bullets chewed branches instead of soil. He noticed how sound traveled differently near the ground, how the forest floor swallowed movement. None of this required permission to understand. It only required attention, and attention was the one resource the Hürtgen demanded without mercy. That attention would soon be tested under real fire, in real time, with lives measured in seconds. The forest did not care if his conclusions were right. It would judge them immediately. Under the oak, the rifleman adjusted his body until even his breath felt invisible. Cold crept in. Time slowed. Somewhere above, doctrine was still fighting the last war. Below, something quieter was about to begin. An experiment born not from theory, but from necessity, carried out without witnesses and destined to spread without a name. In the Hürtgen, change never arrived in orders. It arrived in moments like this, when a man chose to trust what the ground taught him instead of what paper demanded. The forest had already taken enough. Whether this choice would save anyone, or simply add another body to the count, was about to be decided, quietly, beneath a fallen tree. The outcome would echo far beyond that morning, long after the snow melted and the forest forgot. No reports would capture it yet, but survival writes its own rules. The fallen oak did not look special. That was the point. In the Hürtgen, the forest floor was littered with wreckage. Trees torn out by artillery, trunks snapped by blast and rot, root balls clawing at the air like frozen waves. To an untrained eye, every log looked the same, dead wood sinking slowly back into the earth. To someone who had learned to read ground the way others read faces, a few of those trees offered something rare. Not advantage, disappearance. The rifleman found the oak during a patrol 2 days before the fight. It lay at a shallow angle, its roots ripped free, leaving a hollow where soil had collapsed inward. Snow had drifted against the trunk, sealing gaps, softening edges. From a distance, it was just another obstacle. From closer in, it was still just another obstacle. That mattered more than armor. He didn't dig. Digging left scars the forest remembered. Fresh earth caught the eye. Instead, he slid into what already existed, letting the tree do the work. The space beneath was barely high enough to breathe without lifting his head. He wormed forward on elbows, pulling his rifle alongside him, careful not to scrape bark or snap frozen twigs. The ground was hard mud, frozen solid enough to support his weight without leaving prints. That too mattered. The oak was thick, solid wood that could stop small arms fire. Its root mass formed a natural backstop, blocking any silhouette from behind. From his position, the rifleman had a horizontal slit of vision, no more than a few inches tall, but it stretched out across the forest floor for hundreds of yards. He could see where boots would step, where knees would bend, where men moved when they thought they were unseen. He could not see the sky. He could not see branches exploding overhead. He accepted that trade without hesitation. This was not a sniper's nest as taught on ranges. There was no sweeping panorama, no long arc of visibility. There was concealment instead. Concealment that worked because it exploited expectation. Humans searched for threats where threats had always come from. They searched above ground level. They searched where weapons usually appeared. They did not search where the forest itself seemed unbroken. The risks were real. Ground-level fighting in winter invited hypothermia. Moisture seeped upward through woolen canvas. With no movement to generate heat, the body bled warmth, steadily, invisibly. 4 hours could be enough to kill you without a single bullet fired. The rifleman knew this. He packed snow against gaps to seal wind, controlled his breathing, minimized motion. Survival became a balance between stillness and circulation, between patience and frost. He tested the hide by waiting. For hours, no shots, no adjustments. He watched a deer pass within 100 yards, its hooves quiet, its head low. He watched German soldiers walk by close enough to hear voices and laughter. None of them looked down. Why would they? Soldiers were trained to fear elevation, trees, ridges, windows. The forest floor was background noise. That observation mattered more than any kill count. It confirmed the theory without words. The forest itself was proof. Back at the line that night, his uniform was soaked and stiff with frozen mud, hands numb, muscles aching. But the calculation had settled into certainty. The position worked not because it was clever, but because it aligned with how people actually perceived danger. That was the difference between gimmicks and adaptation. When he reported in the next morning, details were unnecessary. Officers fighting for survival didn't need diagrams. They needed results. Instructions were simple. Check in by radio. Don't disappear. If it worked, nobody needed to know how. If it failed, nobody would claim responsibility. That was how unofficial change entered the bloodstream of an army at war. Before dawn on December 14th, the rifleman crawled back under the oak in darkness, so complete, he navigated by memory alone. The forest smelled of rot and cold iron. Frost glazed the metal of his rifle. He carried enough ammunition to last hours, knowing he might not feel his fingers by the end. He settled in, packed snow again, and waited for light. Dawn in the Hürtgen did not arrive cleanly. It seeped through the canopy, turning black into layered gray. Shapes emerged slowly. Distance was deceptive. Sound carried strangely. Somewhere north, the German line existed as an idea more than a map. No patrol had ever gone far enough to fix it precisely. That uncertainty was normal here. Certainty got you killed. From beneath the oak, the rifleman watched the forest wake. He did not search for targets yet. He searched for behavior. Where men paused, how they moved, whether they looked down. This hide was not about aggression. It was about letting the enemy reveal himself by following his own habits. When the first movement appeared, a lone soldier crossing casually, cigarette smoke hanging in the cold air, the rifleman did nothing. Firing too early risked everything. Surprise was not measured in seconds. It was measured in patterns. You waited until the enemy committed to his assumptions. The oak held. The forest held. Above them, doctrine still ruled the imagination of men who had never fought under trees like these. Below, a different kind of warfare was taking shape. Low, quiet, patient. Not heroic in the cinematic sense. Effective in the only sense that mattered. When the machine gun finally opened up at 7:23 a.m., it did exactly what machine guns always did. It dominated space, forced heads down, shaped the battlefield. It did not see the rifleman beneath the oak. It could not imagine him there. That blind spot was the true innovation. Not the log, not the position, but the understanding that survival in the Hürtgen belonged to those who learned where the enemy was not looking. The machine gun's rhythm was steady now, a practiced hammering that told you the crew knew exactly where they were shooting. Fire raked the tree line, cut through branches, walked methodically across positions where men instinctively sought cover. Above the rifleman, bullets shattered bark and sent chips raining down. None came low enough to matter. From under the oak, the world narrowed to breath, pressure, and timing. The rifleman did not rush. He let the gun announce itself fully, let German infantry move the way infantry always moved when they believed a machine gun had control. Runners advanced low, confident that the danger lay ahead and above, not beneath their boots. When the first pair appeared through the slit of view, they were not charging. They were repositioning, using the noise to mask movement, trained enough to trust the pattern they had seen work before. The rifleman tracked the lead man smoothly, not thinking about numbers or outcome. Distance, movement, lead, squeeze. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, absorbed by earth and oak. The sound under the log was violent, trapped, but the forest swallowed it quickly. One body dropped. The others froze, weapons snapping upward, eyes searching the trees. That hesitation mattered. It exposed the flaw. Men looked where they were taught to look. The rifleman worked the bolt slowly, deliberately. Brass struck wood and mud. He fired again. Another figure collapsed, shock registering too late to matter. A third man ran, instinct overriding training. He vanished into brush, alive but changed. The machine gun stuttered, then fell silent. Silence in the Hürtgen was never empty. It stretched, thick and listening. The rifleman did not move. Movement was the enemy now. His ears rang. Cold seeped deeper. He controlled his breathing and watched. More Germans appeared, this time cautious, spread out, weapons up. They knew a sniper was present. They did not know where. They searched in disciplined arcs, trees, ridges, trunks. None of them scanned the forest floor. None of them questioned the assumption beneath their fear. The rifleman let them close. Range shrank. Angles clarified. He chose targets the way hunters chose deer. Closest first, cleanest shot, minimum movement. Each shot was a commitment, each pause a shield. Return fire cracked overhead, blind and angry. Bark flew, snow jumped, nothing touched the ground where he lay. Minutes blurred, the cold gnawed. Fingers stiffened, then warmed briefly with movement, then stiffened again. He reloaded by feel. The forest floor became a ledger of decisions. Advance punished, hesitation fatal, discipline inverted by expectation. Radio chatter crackled faintly through his earpiece. The platoon was pulling back, leapfrogging through chaos. He acknowledged once briefly, words were unnecessary. His job was to buy time, not explain how. When a German machine gun team tried to reposition, confidence gave them away. Ammunition boxes, urgency, the assumption that speed equaled safety. The riflemen corrected that assumption quickly. One carrier fell, another stumbled. The gun itself lay abandoned, useless without hands. Fire shifted again, higher, desperate. By now the Germans were hunting him, or thought they were. Bullets stitched trunks, searched likely hides, punished elevation. The riflemen pressed flatter, trusting the oak, trusting the forest's blind spot. It held. More movement, a flanking attempt. Good soldiers this time, careful, methodical. He broke them the same way, by letting habit betray them. Shots rang out, then silence. The count did not matter. What mattered was effect. The advance stalled. The forest reclaimed momentum. When the last figure appeared, a man gesturing, directing, trying to impose order, the rifleman waited until certainty replaced urgency. He breathed out and fired. The figure fell. The line wavered. The attack dissolved. Only then did the rifleman begin to withdraw, inching backward, never rising, never breaking the log's protection. It took long minutes to move yards. Pain flared and faded. Cold burned. But he emerged alive, mud-caked, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what had just happened. Word spread anyway, not through reports or citations, but through the oldest network in war. Men talking. They asked where he'd been. He didn't answer. They didn't need details, they needed proof that the forest could be beaten on its own terms. In the days that followed, others tried it. Some succeeded, some failed. All learned. No orders changed. No doctrine shifted overnight. But beneath fallen trees and root balls, something new took hold. An understanding that in places like the Hürtgen, survival belonged to those willing to disappear. Long after the snow melted, after maps were redrawn and manuals rewritten, the forest would keep this lesson quietly. Innovation did not arrive with permission. It arrived with necessity, low to the ground, invisible until it worked. What followed did not look like a revolution. There were no briefings, no chalkboard sketches, no officer standing up to announce a new way of fighting in the forest. In the Hürtgen, change never arrived that way. It moved the way rumors move, quietly, sideways, carried by men who had seen something work and refused to forget it. Within days, riflemen from other squads began experimenting, not copying exactly, not formalizing anything, just testing the idea where it made sense. A hollow log here, a root ball there, a shallow depression that broke a silhouette. Some men stayed too long and paid for it with frostbitten fingers and shaking hands. Others learned to rotate, to trade positions, to balance concealment with survival. Nobody wrote it down. Everybody watched. The Germans noticed before the Americans did. Fire that once searched high began to lose its effect. Counter-snipers who had been lethal weeks earlier found themselves blind, aiming into branches while shots came from places they could not locate. After-action reports complained of fire originating from ground level, of positions that vanished the moment indirect fire arrived. The forest, once an ally, became unpredictable. But war is not only adaptation and efficiency, it is also restraint, hesitation, and moments that cut against the logic of killing. On November 12, 1944, not far from where these fights raged, a wounded American lay crying out in a minefield known as the WWII. The mines were laid so densely that even experienced engineers avoided them. German infantry nearby heard the cries. Instead of firing, a young German officer ordered his men to hold their fire. He waved a Red Cross flag and stepped forward to help rescue the wounded enemy soldier. He never made it. A mine detonated beneath him, killing him instantly. His name was Friedrich Lengfeld. Days later, American soldiers buried him with care. Decades after the war, U.S. veterans erected a monument to him in a German cemetery, the only American monument in such a place. The inscription reads, "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." That story traveled too, quietly, as a reminder that even in forests designed to erase humanity, choices still mattered. Back at the line, the ground-level hides continued to spread. Not as doctrine, as practice. Men who had watched friends die in trees were unwilling to climb again. Officers looked the other way. Survival spoke louder than tradition. No courtrooms, no formal punishments, just an unspoken understanding. If it keeps men alive, don't ask too many questions. By January 1945, the fighting moved. Other forests, other fronts. The Hürtgen faded into memory as the Ardennes erupted to the south. But the lesson remained. Soldiers carried it with them, the way hunters carry instinct, without names, without citations. After the war, armies did what armies always do. They studied, they wrote, they revised manuals years later, distilling experience into clean language and diagrams. Ground-level concealment in forest terrain appeared not as a breakthrough by a single man, but as a collective adaptation born of necessity. No footnotes named the rifleman who figured it out while freezing beneath fallen trees. History rarely does. The men themselves went home. They did not lecture. They did not publish. They worked jobs, raised families, and avoided talking about places where the forest swallowed sound and memory alike. If asked, they said what infantrymen always say. They did their job and came back. Only much later did historians begin piecing together what had actually happened in those woods. They read German reports complaining of unseen shooters. They cross-referenced unit logs noting sudden drops in exposed sniper casualties. They interviewed veterans who described learning to fight from the dirt without ever being told to. The conclusion was unremarkable and profound at the same time. Innovation had occurred at the lowest possible level, driven by survival, not policy. Today, ground-level hides are taught as common sense in wooded environments. Soldiers learn to use fallen timber, depressions, and natural backstops. They learn that concealment often matters more than view. The lesson feels obvious now. That is how successful adaptations age. They lose their drama and become assumed. But in the winter of 1944, it was not obvious. It was a risk taken by men who understood that obedience without thought could be fatal. Men who paid attention to what the forest punished and what it allowed. Men who accepted that credit did not matter if others lived. The Hürtgen forest remains quiet now. Trees have grown back. Trails cross places where entire platoons once disappeared. If you walk there, nothing tells you where someone lay beneath a log, breathing slowly, waiting while doctrine failed above him. Nothing marks the moment a pattern was broken. That is how innovation usually happens in war. Not with applause, not with approval, but with someone low to the ground, cold and patient, choosing to see what others refused to look for. By the time the war ended, no one was keeping a scorecard for moments like that morning in the forest. Victory was measured in borders crossed, cities taken, surrender documents signed. The quiet adjustments that kept ordinary soldiers alive rarely made it into official summaries. They didn't fit neatly into after-action reports. They didn't carry names. When the men who had fought in the Hürtgen returned home, they returned alone. Not as innovators, not as pioneers, as workers, husbands, fathers. They stepped off trains carrying duffel bags and habits that didn't translate easily into civilian life. Listening too carefully, moving too quietly, noticing how crowds scanned threats that weren't there. If they were asked about the war, they kept it short. Infantrymen always did. Talking didn't change what had happened. Years later, the Army did what institutions eventually do when enough evidence piles up. It studied past fights. It compared casualty rates. It gathered accounts from different theaters and noticed patterns that had once been invisible. Forest combat demanded different assumptions. Elevation was not automatically an advantage. Concealment at ground level could neutralize an enemy who expected danger to come from above. Manuals began to reflect what soldiers had learned the hard way, freezing beneath trees long before anyone thought to write it down. No paragraph credited a single rifleman. No footnote mentioned a fallen oak in December 1944. The lessons appeared abstracted, sanitized, presented as logical conclusions, rather than desperate experiments born under fire. That too was normal. Armies preferred doctrine without ghosts. By the early 21st century, soldiers training for wooded environments learned techniques that would have seemed reckless in 1944, using root balls as backstops, breaking silhouettes by sinking into depressions, accepting limited visibility in exchange for near-total concealment. They practiced patience measured in hours, not minutes. They learned to think horizontally, to expect threats at their own level rather than above it. What had once been a quiet improvisation became standard practice. Most of the men who had discovered it first were already gone. The forest itself remembered nothing. Trees fell and regrew. Snow melted and returned. Places where men once lay motionless for hours became ordinary ground again. Visitors walking those woods today see nothing that explains why so many died there or how some survived. History does not mark the spaces where ideas are born in silence, and yet the influence remains. Every time a soldier chooses concealment over exposure in dense woodland, every time someone trusts the ground to hide what the sky would reveal, the Hürtgen whispers back, not as a legend, as a lesson. This is why stories like this matter, not because of numbers or dramatic claims, but because they reveal how change actually happens under pressure, not through command decisions or perfectly timed innovations, but through individuals who notice what reality demands and act before permission arrives. People who accept consequences quietly because survival is worth more than recognition. The title says they banned it. In truth, it was never formally banned because it was never formally acknowledged. That is often worse. Ideas that save lives can exist in a gray space, unofficial, uncelebrated, passed hand to hand without credit. They live or die based on whether someone is willing to trust them when it counts. On that winter morning, beneath a fallen oak, a rifleman trusted the forest more than the rules. He did not do it to make a point. He did it because the alternative was watching more men climb into sight lines that ended in splintered trees and blood on snow. The forest rewarded that choice, not with honor, but with survival. History did not build him a monument. It did not carve his name into doctrine. It folded his lesson into something larger and moved on. That is how most progress works. Quietly absorbed, stripped of origin, treated as inevitable in hindsight, but inevitability is an illusion. Someone has to be first. Someone has to lie in the cold long enough to see what others miss. Someone has to accept that doing the right thing may never be acknowledged. If you stand in those woods today, nothing tells you where it happened. No plaque marks the log. No sign explains the ground-level hide. The forest looks ordinary, peaceful even. That is its final trick. It erases evidence of the choices made within it. Yet the choice remains, carried forward wherever soldiers fight, in places where visibility is a liability and patience is a weapon. The forest floor still hides men willing to wait, to think differently, to refuse habits that no longer fit the ground beneath them. That is how innovation survives, not in records or speeches, but in practice, passed on by those who lived because someone before them decided not to look up.